In a decision that echoed across government and global markets, the Supreme Court has made a move that is already being called historic by legal experts and policymakers alike. The court has temporarily halted the Trump administration's sweeping new tariff plan, a policy that had the potential to reshape the landscape of international trade and impact countless businesses and consumers. This move marks a significant judicial check on presidential authority in international trade, an area where presidents have long held considerable sway, often acting swiftly in response to global economic shifts. The ruling places the policy on indefinite hold, pending further legal review, and signals the court's concern over the expanding scope of executive power. It underscores the judiciary's vital role in maintaining the balance of power among the branches of government. For American businesses, the decision offers a temporary reprieve from potentially crippling costs, giving manufacturers, importers, and small business owners a much-needed pause to assess their next steps and plan for the future. Meanwhile, international partners are closely watching, seeing a new dynamic in trade negotiations, and recalibrating their strategies as uncertainty lingers over U.S. trade policy. At its core, the case raises a fundamental constitutional question. Does the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations truly belong to Congress, as outlined in the Constitution, or can it be broadly delegated to the President in times of economic urgency? The debate over this delegation of power is not new, but the stakes have never been higher, as executive orders increasingly shape the nation's economic direction. The Supreme Court's intervention has pressed pause on a major policy, forcing a national conversation about the separation of powers in a complex global economy, and highlighting the ongoing tension between swift executive action and careful legislative oversight. How the branches of government respond in the coming months will shape not only U.S. trade policy, but also the very limits of presidential power for years to come, setting precedents that could influence future administrations and global economic relations. The American Economic Security Initiative, unveiled in early 2025, introduced a sweeping set of tariffs on imported goods, marking one of the most significant shifts in U.S. trade policy in decades. The plan was designed to reshape the landscape of international commerce and strengthen the nation's economic resilience. These tariffs specifically targeted a broad range of manufactured products and raw materials, with a focus on imports from key economic partners that have historically dominated U.S. supply chains. Central to the proposal was a 25% tariff imposed on all imported automobiles and auto parts originating from the European Union and Japan, two regions with robust automotive industries and deep trade ties to the U.S. In addition, a 15% tariff was levied on consumer electronics imported from Southeast Asia, a region that supplies a significant portion of America's tech products, from smartphones to home appliances. The administration justified these measures as a response to what it described as persistent unfair trade practices. By leveraging detailed trade data, officials aimed to pinpoint and penalize industries and nations that, in their view, undermined American competitiveness. Officials argued that these tariffs were not just about economics, but also about national security. They cited the country's growing dependence on foreign suppliers for critical goods as a vulnerability, and claimed that the new tariffs would help revitalize domestic manufacturing and reduce strategic risks. The plan included a phased rollout, intended to give businesses time to adapt to the new costs and supply chain realities. However, industries heavily reliant on imports voiced strong concerns about potential disruptions, higher prices, and the challenge of finding alternative suppliers. According to estimates from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the tariffs would impact over $500 billion in annual imports, highlighting the unprecedented scale and potential ripple effects across the economy. Unsurprisingly, the sweeping nature of the plan sparked fierce opposition from both business groups and political leaders. Many argued that the tariffs would hurt American consumers and exporters, leading to a wave of legal challenges that have now reached the Supreme Court. The scope and justification of the proposal have made it a central flashpoint in the ongoing debate over the limits of executive power in shaping trade policy, and its outcome could set a precedent for years to come. A powerful coalition of corporations, industry groups, and state attorneys general challenged the tariff plan, arguing it was an overreach of executive power. Their case centered on the Constitution's Commerce Clause, which grants Congress, not the President, the authority to regulate foreign commerce. They claimed the administration's use of trade statutes like Section 301 and Section 232 was unconstitutionally broad, intended for targeted responses, not sweeping policy changes. Economic models predicted price hikes and supply chain disruptions, suggesting the national security justification was a pretext for broader economic goals. Lower courts issued conflicting rulings, making Supreme Court review inevitable. The core question: does the president's interpretation of delegated trade authority erase Congress's constitutional role? The Supreme Court's stay signals the gravity of this constitutional debate. The Supreme Court's 6-3 opinion centered on the non-delegation doctrine, a foundational principle that restricts Congress from transferring its core legislative powers to the executive branch without providing clear and specific guidelines. This doctrine is designed to maintain the constitutional separation of powers, ensuring that no single branch of government can overstep its bounds or act without proper oversight. In this case, the majority found that the administration's interpretation of existing trade laws was dangerously expansive. Instead of applying the law to address specific, well-defined issues, the executive branch was seen as transforming a targeted authority into a sweeping legislative action, effectively bypassing the checks and balances intended by the Constitution. The opinion emphasized that Congress originally crafted trade statutes to address particular national security threats, not to grant the executive the power to restructure entire sectors of the economy at will. The court stressed that such broad interpretations could have far-reaching consequences for both the economy and the rule of law. The justices warned that if executive power goes unchecked, any major industry could be labeled essential to national security, opening the door for sweeping interventions and undermining the delicate balance between the branches of government. This, they argued, would erode the separation of powers that is fundamental to American democracy. The stay issued by the court is a procedural move rather than a final judgment on the merits of the case. However, it sends a strong signal that any sweeping trade actions taken by the executive may ultimately require explicit and detailed congressional approval to withstand constitutional scrutiny. By issuing this ruling, the court has placed the constitutional balance of power squarely at the center of the ongoing debate over trade policy, reminding all branches of government of their distinct roles and responsibilities. Both the executive and legislative branches are now on notice. Any transformative changes to trade policy must be clearly backed by legislation, not just executive interpretation or action. Ultimately, the decision underscores the constitutional limits of presidential authority in economic matters, reinforcing the need for clear, democratically enacted laws to guide major policy shifts. In dissent, 3 justices argued the court was overstepping, insisting the president has broad authority to act on national security and trade. They maintained that Congress intentionally gave the executive flexibility to respond quickly to global threats, and that economic security is inseparable from national security. The dissent warned that limiting executive discretion could weaken America's ability to protect its interests. They argued that if Congress disagrees with the president's actions, it can amend the law. Courts should not substitute their policy preferences. Ultimately, the dissent framed the issue as one of necessary executive agility in a dangerous world. The Supreme Court's announcement sent shockwaves through financial markets, with U.S. stock futures surging and shares of automakers and tech companies rallying. Investors welcomed the pause, fearing the tariffs would have triggered inflation and disrupted earnings. The dollar weakened slightly against the euro and yen, reflecting eased trade tensions. Shipping and logistics data showed businesses halting costly supply chain adjustments, at least temporarily. The decision averted immediate economic upheaval, but uncertainty remains. This is only a temporary stay. Many companies are delaying long-term investments until the legal battle is resolved. The initial market relief is tempered by the knowledge that the fundamental dispute over trade policy is far from settled. The business world is now in a state of watchful waiting. The Trump administration now faces several choices. It can continue the legal fight in lower courts, hoping to justify its actions under existing law, a slow and uncertain process. Alternatively, it could seek new legislation from Congress, but building support for broad tariff authority would be politically challenging. The administration might also pivot to more targeted trade actions or pursue new trade agreements, avoiding sweeping unilateral tariffs. Another option is to modify the tariff plan, narrowing its scope to withstand legal scrutiny, though this risks further court battles. Each path carries risks and rewards, and the administration's decision will shape its legacy on trade. The outcome will also redefine the relationship between the executive, Congress, and the courts. The next steps will determine the future direction of U.S. trade policy. The Supreme Court's decision has rippled across the globe, prompting relief among America's trading partners. The EU and Japan, primary targets of the tariffs, welcomed the pause as a chance for renewed diplomacy and de-escalation. Southeast Asian nations facing electronics tariffs now have time to adjust and may push for more stable trade policies. The ruling reinforces the role of international trade bodies and highlights the limits of unilateral U.S. action. For China, the decision signals that U.S. presidential power is not absolute, influencing its own strategic calculations. The intervention injects uncertainty, but also opens the door for a reset in global trade relations. International partners are watching closely to see if the U.S. will pursue collaboration or return to unilateralism. The fundamental issues of competition and globalization remain unresolved. The Supreme Court's stay on the tariff plan marks a pivotal moment in the debate over presidential power and trade policy. The ruling, rooted in the separation of powers, blocks a policy that would have imposed major tariffs on key allies. The court's concern, the administration's broad interpretation of its authority, threatened Congress's primary role in trade. Markets and industries have gained temporary relief, but the legal and diplomatic fallout continues. The White House must now choose between legal appeals, seeking new authority, or changing its trade approach. The decision has global implications, affecting allies, competitors, and the future of international trade. The tension between executive action and legislative oversight is now front and center. The nation must decide, will Congress reassert its authority, or is this just a pause in the trend toward greater executive control?